The autumn wind rattled the old Victorian windows as Margaret Harrison climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, her arthritic knees protesting with each step. At 78, she had avoided this dusty sanctuary for years, but the real estate agent insisted the house needed to be completely cleared before listing. 53 years in this house, 47 of them with Bob, and now she was preparing to say goodbye to everything they had built together in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The attic smelled of mothballs and forgotten memories. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, labeled in Bob's meticulous handwriting. Christmas decorations, David's school papers, Sarah's art projects. Maggie smiled despite her melancholy. Even in death, her husband's organizational skills haunted every corner of their home. She remembered how he would spend entire weekends up here, arranging and rearranging their accumulated possessions with the same precision he brought to his accounting practice. As she moved toward the far corner where old furniture created deep shadows, her foot caught on a loose floorboard. Steadying herself against a wooden beam, she noticed something odd. Behind the beam, wedged tightly against the wall where the roof sloped lowest, was a small wooden box she had never seen before. Her heart skipped a beat. In all their years together, she thought she knew every inch of this house, every hiding place, every secret corner. The box was heavy, made of dark cherry wood with brass corners that had tarnished with age. No lock, just a simple latch that opened with a soft click that seemed to echo in the dusty silence. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, were bundles of letters tied with blue ribbon. The return address made her blood run cold. L. Thompson, 1247 Maple Street, Riverside, Iowa. The letters were addressed to Robert Harrison, her Bob. The postmark spanned decades, from the early 1980s to just 2 years before his sudden heart attack. With trembling fingers, she opened the first letter, dated 15 years ago. My dearest Robert. It began in elegant feminine handwriting. I cannot stop thinking about our afternoon together yesterday. The way you held me, the promises you made about our future when we walked by the river. I know you say you need more time to figure things out, but how much longer can we continue this way? Michael asks about you constantly, and I'm running out of explanations for why his father can't spend more time with us. Maggie's legs gave out, Todd, and she sank onto an old trunk that had belonged to Bob's mother. The letter continued with intimate details that made her stomach lurch. References to secret meetings in hotel rooms, to birthdays celebrated in hidden restaurants, to dreams of a legitimate life together. Once you're finally free from your obligations. The handwriting was elegant and confident. Nothing like her own practical, librarian script that had filled thousands of index cards over the years. She forced herself to read more, her hands shaking as she unfolded letter after letter. The correspondence revealed a relationship spanning decades, a love affair that had somehow existed parallel to her own marriage, without her knowledge. The woman wrote about holidays spent alone while Bob claimed to be working, about their son's school performances that Bob could never attend officially, about the careful choreography required to maintain their secret life. But it was the letter dated just 2 years before Bob's heart attack that shattered Maggie's world completely. Our son graduates college next month, and I know you can't be there officially, but Michael understands. He's proud to have your eyes, your determination, your sense of humor, even if he can't have your name on his diploma. He wants to be a teacher like me, says he wants to help shape young minds the way you've shaped his. 23 years we've been doing this dance, Robert, and I'm tired of hiding. I love you enough to keep waiting, but I won't wait forever. Our son, Michael, a child Bob had never mentioned, never acknowledged to his legal family. A young man who had graduated college while Maggie believed she knew everything about her husband's life. Maggie sat in the dusty attic as evening shadows lengthened through the small window, her entire life feeling like a carefully constructed lie. The man she had loved and mourned for 6 years had lived a double life that lasted longer than some marriages. How many weekend fishing trips with his buddies had actually been visits to another family? How many late nights at the office during tax season had been spent in another woman's arms? How many times had he looked her in the eye and lied about where he'd been, who he'd seen, what he'd done? The box contained more than just love letters. At the bottom, beneath layers of correspondence, she found receipts from a jewelry store in Riverside, where Bob had apparently been a regular customer for decades, purchasing necklaces and earrings and anniversary gifts she had never received. Restaurant receipts from romantic dinners at establishments she had never heard of, in towns she had never visited with him. Movie ticket stubs for films they had never seen together. Souvenirs from weekend getaways she had never taken. There were bank statements, too, for an account she didn't recognize, showing regular deposits and withdrawals that painted a picture of financial support spanning years. Bob had been supporting 2 households, 2 families, 2 completely separate lives, and somehow managing the book so carefully that she had never noticed the missing money. As the clock tower in downtown Cedar Falls chimed 9 times, Maggie carefully placed everything back in the box, her movements automatic as her mind reeled with implications. Tomorrow she would begin investigating properly. Tonight she needed to process the revelation that her 50-year marriage had been built on deception, so thorough, so carefully maintained, that she questioned her own ability to perceive reality. She closed the attic door behind her, knowing that her old life was ending even though she didn't yet understand what would replace it. The woman who had climbed those stairs this morning had been a widow, mourning a faithful husband. The woman descending them was someone else entirely, a stranger to herself, questioning every memory, every assumption, every truth she had built her identity around. The next morning brought crisp October air and a determination Maggie hadn't felt in years. She had spent the night pacing her bedroom, memories flooding back with new and sinister context. Bob's unexplained absences that always had perfectly reasonable explanations. Phone calls he always took in private, stepping out onto the back porch or into his home office. The separate checking account he claimed was for business expenses and tax planning. Credit card bills that never quite added up, with charges in towns where he supposedly had clients she never met. How had she been so blind? Or perhaps the better question was, how had he been so skilled at deception? Bob had always been methodical, organized, the kind of man who planned everything down to the smallest detail. She was beginning to understand that their entire marriage had been one of his projects, carefully managed and meticulously maintained to prevent any overlap with his other life. After a breakfast she couldn't taste, she drove to the Cedar Falls Public Library, where she had worked as head librarian for 40 years before retirement. Old habits died hard, and research had always been her greatest strength. If Linda Thompson lived in Riverside, Iowa, it was time to learn everything about her. The reference librarian, Janet, had been Maggie's assistant for 15 years and was delighted to help with what Maggie described as genealogy research for the family history. Using the library's internet access and database subscriptions, Maggie spent 3 hours learning about the woman who had shared her husband's heart. Linda Marie Thompson, age 75, retired after 37 years teaching high school English, divorced in 1974, never remarried. One son, Michael Robert Thompson, born October 15, 1976, when David was 5 years old and Sarah was barely 2. The timing made Maggie's stomach clench with understanding. Linda owned her house outright, had an exemplary credit rating, volunteered at the local literacy center, and maintained a small but well-tended garden that had won several community beautification awards. She was, by all appearances, a respectable woman who had built a quiet, stable life in a small town. Nothing in the public record suggested scandal or impropriety. The drive to Riverside took 45 minutes through rolling farmland, painted in autumn colors that reminded Maggie of the landscapes she and Bob used to admire during their Sunday drives. She wondered how many of those scenic routes had been reconnaissance missions. Bob learning the roads between his two lives, calculating drive times and planning logistics for his elaborate deception. She parked across from 1247 Maple Street, a modest blue house with white shutters and a well-maintained garden where mums bloomed in autumn splendor. The mailbox confirmed her target, L. Thompson, in neat black letters. No car in the driveway, but smoke rising from the chimney suggested someone was home. Maggie sat in her car for an hour, gathering courage and observing the neighborhood, noting the careful way the lawn was maintained, the seasonal decorations that suggested someone who took pride in their home. At noon, a silver Honda Civic pulled into the driveway. The woman who emerged was petite, perhaps 75 as the records indicated, with gray hair styled in a modern bob that suggested regular salon visits. She moved with the confidence of someone comfortable in their own skin, carrying grocery bags with the efficiency of long practice. This was Linda Thompson, the woman who had shared her husband's heart for 23 years. Maggie waited 3 days before making her move. 3 days of sleepless nights and careful planning. She needed a believable story, a reason to approach Linda without revealing her true identity immediately. Finally, inspiration struck during her morning coffee as she watched the local news report about the Cedar Falls Historical Society's annual fundraising drive. She would pose as a volunteer researcher documenting longtime Iowa families for their archives. When Linda answered her door that Friday afternoon, Maggie's carefully rehearsed introduction almost caught in her throat. Up close, Linda was beautiful in a way that complemented rather than competed with Maggie's own looks. Where Maggie was tall and angular with silver white hair and strong features, Linda was petite and curved with auburn hair that maintained professional highlights and soft features that suggested kindness. They could have been frenas under different circumstances. Two educated women who had devoted their lives to nurturing others. Mrs. Thompson, I'm Margaret Wilson from the Cedar Falls Historical Society. Maggie lied smoothly, the false name rolling off her tongue with surprising ease. I'm researching prominent local families for our archives, and your name came up in connection with the Harrison family. I understand you knew Robert Harrison? Linda's face went pale, her hand tightening on the doorframe. But she recovered quickly with the poise of someone who had spent decades managing difficult situations. Please come in. Yes, I knew Bob. He was a dear family friend for many years. The living room was decorated with the taste of someone who appreciated beauty but lived within modest means. Books lined built-in shelves, plants thrived in every window, and family photographs covered surfaces with the abundance of someone proud of their relationships. But it was the photograph on the mantel that took Maggie's breath away. A picture of a man who looked exactly like Bob, but younger, wearing a graduation cap and gown, and smiling with an expression she recognized as purely Harrison family genetics. That's my son, Michael, Linda said, following Maggie's gaze with obvious pride. He's a teacher now, like I was. Teaches high school history in Des Moines, and coaches the debate team. He's always been good with words, good at helping people understand complicated situations. He has such strong features, Maggie managed, her voice steady despite her racing heart. He reminds me of someone, though I can't place who. Linda's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea from a service that Maggie recognized as expensive, probably a gift from someone who loved her very much. People say that sometimes. He takes after his father in many ways. His integrity, his dedication to education, his way of making everyone feel heard and valued. For the next hour, Maggie asked careful questions about Cedar Falls history, while Linda shared memories that painted a picture of deep, lasting love. She spoke of Bob with an intimacy that was unmistakable, referring to private jokes and shared experiences that Maggie had never been part of. She mentioned weekend trips to state parks, quiet dinners at family-owned restaurants, long conversations about books and politics and dreams for the future. "Bob was the most honorable man I ever knew," Linda said, her voice thick with emotion that had clearly never faded. "He was torn between duty and love for so many years, trying to do right by everyone who depended on him. I always told him I understood why he couldn't leave his family. His children needed him, and I respected that about him." The words hit Maggie like physical blows. Honorable? The man who had maintained 2 families for decades? But as Linda continued talking, Maggie began to understand a different perspective. In Linda's version of events, Bob was a man trapped between 2 loves, unable to hurt either family by choosing, struggling with competing loyalties that pulled him in impossible directions. When Maggie finally left, promising to send Linda a copy of the Historical Society's publication, her head was spinning with new information and disturbing questions. Michael Thompson was 48 years old, born when David was 5, and Sarah was a newborn. Bob had started his double life early in their marriage, during what Maggie had always considered their happiest years, when they were young parents building their future together in their first house. That evening she returned to the attic box with fresh eyes and a growing sense of dread. Hidden beneath the letters, she found a manila envelope containing documents that made her gasp. Bank statements for an account she had never known existed, opened in 1975 and maintained until Bob's death. An account that had been regularly funded by transfers from their joint savings, carefully hidden among legitimate business expenses and tax planning moves. Over the decades, Bob had moved nearly $200,000 into this secret account. Money that should have been building their retirement fund or paying for their children's college educations. The statements showed regular withdrawals that corresponded to dates Maggie now recognized as birthdays, holidays, and special occasions in Michael's life. More devastating were the insurance papers tucked between bank statements. Bob had maintained 2 life insurance policies through different companies, one for $500,000 with Maggie as beneficiary, the policy she had received after his passing and used to pay off their mortgage. But there was another policy, purchased through his business association for $300,000 with Michael Robert Thompson as the sole beneficiary. At the bottom of the envelope, wrapped in tissue paper like a precious document, was a birth certificate. Michael Robert Thompson, born October 15, 1976, at Riverside Community Hospital. Father listed as Robert James Harrison. Mother listed as Linda Marie Thompson. Her husband had legally acknowledged this child, signing official papers and creating a permanent record, even as he kept the boy's existence secret from his legal family. Maggie spent the weekend in a fog of revelation and grief, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to focus on anything except the magnitude of Bob's deception. She had mourned him as a faithful husband who died too young, a man devoted to his family and his community. Now she was forced to mourn the man she thought she knew, while grappling with the reality of who he actually was. The love she thought they shared had been divided, parceled out between 2 women, 2 families, 2 completely separate existences. She found herself studying their wedding photos with new eyes, looking for signs she had missed. Had Bob been thinking of someone else when he promised to forsake all others? Had he already met Linda when he spoke those vows? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, spreading through every memory, contaminating every shared moment with doubt and suspicion. Monday morning brought unexpected courage born from exhaustion and rage. If Bob had lived a double life, if he had children she didn't know about, then she needed to understand the full scope of his deception. More importantly, she needed to understand if her own children knew anything about their half-brother, if she had been the only one living in ignorance, while everyone else protected her from uncomfortable truths. She started with Sarah, her younger daughter, inviting her for lunch at Maggie's Cafe, their favorite restaurant in downtown Cedar Falls, where they had shared countless, mother-daughter conversations over the years. Sarah arrived looking stressed, her marriage to Tom hitting another rough patch, her teenage daughter, Emma, becoming increasingly rebellious and difficult, the familiar pattern of family crisis management that had defined their relationship since Sarah's adolescence. "Mom, you look different," Sarah observed over their usual order of soup and sandwiches. "There's something in your eyes I haven't seen since before Dad passed away. You look like you're planning something." Maggie took a deep breath, steeling herself for a conversation that would change their relationship forever. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. No protecting my feelings, no trying to spare me difficult truths. Did your father ever mention anything about other family members? Distant relatives? Perhaps children from previous relationships or complicated family situations?" Sarah's fork clattered to her plate, her face draining of color in a way that told Maggie everything she needed to know before her daughter even spoke. "Mom, why would you ask something like that? What happened? What did you find? Just answer me, sweetheart. Please, I need to know what you know." Sarah looked around the restaurant nervously, then leaned forward across the small table. "There was something. About 5 years ago. I was helping Dad organize his office files before tax season, and I found some papers mixed in with his client folders. Insurance documents with a name I didn't recognize. Some kind of beneficiary paperwork. When I asked him about it, he got really upset and said it was complicated business stuff I wouldn't understand. Something about protecting clients' privacy. What name was on the papers? Michael Thompson. Dad made me promise never to mention it to you or David. He said it would only cause confusion and pain, that some things were better left alone." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as understanding began to dawn. "Mom, what's going on? What did you find in the attic?" Maggie reached across the table and took her daughter's hands, noting how much they looked like Bob's hands, long-fingered and graceful. "I found evidence that your father had another life, Sarah. Another family that he supported and visited for decades. And Michael Thompson is your half-brother." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She went pale, then flushed red with anger, her emotions cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that looked like relief. "That's impossible. Dad would never... He loved you. He loved us. He was the most devoted father and husband in Cedar Falls. I believe he did love us," Maggie said carefully, watching her daughter process information that was reshaping everything she believed about their family. "But he also loved them, and we need to figure out what that means for our family now." Sarah's immediate response was denial, but as Maggie shared more details from the letters and documents, her daughter's anger shifted to something more complex, a mixture of betrayal, curiosity, and protective fury that reminded Maggie of Bob's own complicated emotions. "If this is true," Sarah whispered, "then everything I believed about my childhood was a lie. All those times Dad wasn't there for school plays or soccer games or parent-teacher conferences because of work emergencies. He was with them. He was being a father to another child while we were growing up, thinking we had his complete attention." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of revelation settling between them like a physical presence. Finally, Sarah looked up with eyes that reminded Maggie of Bob's determined expression when he was solving a particularly difficult problem. "What are you going to do, Mom?" "I'm going to find the truth, all of it, and then I'm going to decide what kind of family we want to be going forward." That afternoon, Maggie made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. She was going to contact Michael Thompson directly, bypass the careful investigation and polite fiction, and confront this situation with the directness that had served her well during 40 years of managing library crises and patron disputes. She found his school easily enough, Roosevelt High School in Des Moines, Iowa. According to the website, Michael Thompson taught American history and coached both the debate team and the academic decathlon squad. His faculty photo showed a man with Bob's eyes and David's serious expression, wearing the same patient smile Bob used when explaining complicated concepts to confused clients. The resemblance was so strong it made her chest ache with recognition and loss. Maggie crafted her letter carefully, sitting at Bob's old desk in his home office, surrounded by the professional certificates and family photos that had defined his public identity. She identified herself only as a family friend of your father's and requested a meeting to discuss matters concerning Robert Harrison's estate that may be of interest to you. She deliberately kept the tone formal and mysterious, hoping to intrigue him enough to respond without scaring him away with premature revelations. She mailed the letter on Wednesday and spent the rest of the week alternating between anticipation and terror, jumping every time the phone rang, checking the mailbox twice daily for a response that might never come. What if he didn't want contact with Bob's legal family? What if Linda had taught him to resent them? What if he was angry about being hidden, bitter about the secrecy that had defined his entire relationship with his father? The phone call came Friday evening while she was washing dinner dishes, trying to maintain normal routines while her world shifted around her. The voice that answered her hesitant "hello" was unmistakably familiar. Bob's voice if Bob had lived to be 48 and spent his life teaching teenagers instead of managing tax returns. "Mrs. Harrison, this is Michael Thompson. I believe you knew my father." The directness of his approach caught her off guard. She had expected evasion, careful probing, the kind of conversational chess game she was prepared to play. "You know who I am?" "I've known about you my entire life," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same gentle authority she remembered from Bob's phone conversations with difficult clients. "My mother showed me pictures of Dad's family when I was young, told me stories about his other life in Cedar Falls. I know you're his wife, his widow, and I know this call must be incredibly difficult for you." Maggie sank into Bob's old recliner, her legs suddenly weak with the realization that this conversation was actually happening. "How long have you known about us?" "Always. Mom believed honesty was important, even when the truth was complicated and painful. I grew up knowing I had a father who loved me, but couldn't be with me full time because he had other responsibilities, other people who depended on him. I know I have 2 half-siblings I've never met, and a stepmother who probably never knew I existed until recently. What do you want from us?" The question came out more harshly than she intended, decades of protective instinct making her voice sharp with suspicion. Michael was quiet for a moment, and she could hear voices in the background. Students, perhaps, or colleagues, finishing their day at school. "I want to belong somewhere, Mrs. Harrison. I'm 48 years old and I've spent my entire life being half of someone's family. When Dad died, I felt like I lost my only connection to my other family, to the part of my heritage that I've never been allowed to claim. I don't want money or property or anything that rightfully belongs to you and your children. I just want to know my brother and sister. I want to understand where I come from, who I am, when I'm not hiding." His honesty disarmed her completely. "This is very overwhelming, Michael. I understand, and I want you to know that I don't blame you for not knowing about me. Dad made his choices, and they weren't always easy for anyone involved. But he loved you deeply. He talked about you often, about your work at the library, about how proud he was of the family you built together. He talked about me. To you, he was proud of your dedication to literacy, proud of how you raised David and Sarah to be thoughtful, principled people. He said you were the strongest person he knew, even though you never realized it. He regretted not being able to give you the full marriage you deserved, but he never regretted marrying you." Maggie found herself crying, tears of grief, anger, and something that might have been relief. For years, especially after Bob's death, she had questioned whether she had been enough for him, whether their marriage had satisfied him intellectually and emotionally. Learning that he had loved another woman was devastating. but learning that he had still valued their relationship provided unexpected comfort. "Would you be willing to meet?" Michael asked. "I could drive to Cedar Falls this weekend if you're ready. Or we could meet somewhere neutral. Whatever would be easier for you. I need to talk to my children first. They need to know what's happening before I make any decisions about family meetings." "Of course, Mrs. Harrison. Thank you for not hanging up on me. Thank you for being brave enough to reach out." After ending the call, Maggie sat in Bob's chair until midnight, processing everything that had happened. In just 3 weeks, she had discovered that her entire adult life had been built on a foundation of half-truths and careful omissions. But instead of feeling destroyed, she was beginning to feel something she hadn't experienced in years: curiosity about what came next, excitement about possibilities she had never imagined. Saturday morning brought an unexpected visitor that changed everything again. David's silver Mercedes pulled into her driveway at 8 o'clock, and her eldest son emerged looking serious and determined in the way that meant he was preparing for a difficult conversation. At 55, David had inherited Bob's methodical nature and strong sense of responsibility, but he had also developed the careful, emotional intelligence that came from 25 years of practicing family law. "Mom, we need to talk," he said without preamble as she opened the front door. "Sarah called me last night. She told me about your discovery in the attic and about Michael Thompson." Maggie led him to the kitchen, her usual refuge for difficult conversations, where the morning light streaming through gingham curtains made everything seem more manageable. "I suppose you think I'm losing my mind, investigating your father like some kind of private detective, stirring up trouble that should stay buried." David sat across from her at the breakfast table where they had shared countless family meals, where he had done homework while she graded library materials, where Bob had explained tax law concepts that helped David choose his own career path. His expression was carefully controlled, the look he wore during difficult client meetings when he was about to deliver news that would change someone's life. "Actually, Mom, I think it's about time." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for years. Maggie studied her son's face, noting the carefully maintained composure that suggested he was containing information rather than processing it for the first time. "What do you mean, about time?" David reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder that looked official and well-organized. "I've known about Michael for 12 years, Mom. Dad came to me when Michael was finishing college during his junior year. He needed legal advice about inheritance issues, about protecting both families if something happened to him. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow, making her chest tight and her breathing shallow. You've known for 12 years, and you never told me? Dad made me promise. He said he would tell you himself when the time was right, after Sarah's kids were older and more settled, after you were more comfortable in retirement. He was planning to tell you everything after his 60th birthday, when he was ready to step back from the business and focus on family. But he died at 58. Yes, heart attack at 58. And I've been living with this secret ever since, wondering if I should honor his wishes or honor what I thought you deserved to know. Every family gathering, every holiday, every time you talked about missing him and wishing you'd had more time together, I wondered if I was doing the right thing by staying silent." Maggie felt the walls of her world shifting again, familiar foundations crumbling as new information reshaped everything she thought she understood. First Bob's betrayal, then Sarah's partial knowledge, now David's complete awareness. How many other secrets was her family keeping? How many conversations had happened around her, protecting her from truths they thought she couldn't handle? "Tell me everything," she demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. "No more protection, no more sparing my feelings. I want the complete truth, and I want it now." David opened the folder and spread documents across the table like evidence in a legal case. "Michael Thompson is our half-brother. Dad met Linda when he was doing business consulting in Riverside in the early 70s, helping small businesses with their books during tax season. According to Dad, it started as an affair but became something deeper than either of them expected. When Linda got pregnant, Dad wanted to do the right thing, but he couldn't bear to divorce you and leave us, so he decided to maintain 2 families instead. In his mind, he was taking care of everyone he loved. He couldn't choose between his responsibilities to us and his feelings for them, so he tried to do both. He provided for Michael financially, visited regularly, helped with school expenses and college tuition. But he also provided for us and stayed committed to our family. Maggie studied the papers David had brought, her librarian's training helping her organize and catalog the information, even as her emotions reeled. Insurance policies she had never seen, college tuition receipts for a child she had never known existed, even birthday and Christmas gifts for Michael, spanning decades. The financial documentation was staggering. Bob had spent nearly $500,000 over the years supporting his second family. The house Michael grew up in? Dad bought it for Linda when Michael was 3. Michael's college education? Dad paid every penny. When Michael needed a car for his student teaching, when Linda had medical bills during a difficult period, when they wanted to take family vacations to help Michael understand the world beyond small-town Iowa, Dad took care of everything. Using money that should have been ours? David shook his head firmly. Using money he earned from overtime, consulting work, side projects that he took on specifically to support both families. Dad worked himself to exhaustion for years, taking on extra clients during tax season, doing bookkeeping for small businesses on weekends, consulting for agricultural cooperatives during summer months. He never took anything away from us to give to them. This revelation reframed everything Maggie thought she knew about Bob's work habits. His long hours, his weekend projects, his reluctance to take vacations, his constant fatigue during tax season. She had attributed it to professional ambition and perfectionism, but it had been responsibility to 2 families that depended on his financial support. Did you ever meet him? Michael? Twice. Dad brought him to my office to discuss legal issues when Michael was in college and then again when he started teaching. He needed advice about estate planning, about protecting both families if something happened to Dad, about making sure everyone would be taken care of legally. What's he like? David's professional composure softened slightly. He's a good man, Mom. Honest, intelligent, grateful for everything Dad did for him. He understands the complexity of the situation, doesn't resent us for having Dad's legal recognition. He just wants acknowledgement, wants to be part of something larger than the half-life he's lived for 48 years. Why didn't you tell me after your father died? David's composure finally cracked, revealing the emotional weight he had been carrying for years. Because I was a coward. I thought you had suffered enough, losing Dad so suddenly, when you still had so many plans together. I thought maybe it was better to let sleeping dogs lie, to let you preserve your memories without complicating them with painful truths. But Sarah said you found the letters, and I realized you were going to uncover everything anyway. You deserve to learn the truth from family, not from investigating on your own like some kind of detective. They sat in silence, processing the magnitude of the family's hidden history. The kitchen clock ticked loudly, marking time that seemed both infinite and insufficient for absorbing such revelations. Finally, Maggie asked the question that had been haunting her since finding the first letter. Did your father love her more than me? David reached across the table and took his mother's hands, his touch gentle and reassuring. He loved you differently, Mom. According to him, you were his anchor, his foundation, the center of his respectable life. You gave him stability and social standing and a family he was proud to show the world. Linda was his passion, his escape from the weight of responsibility. He needed both of you for different reasons, but he couldn't imagine his life without either relationship. That doesn't make it right. No, it doesn't. but it might help you understand that his deception wasn't about you not being enough. You were everything he needed in a wife and partner and co-parent. She was everything he needed in a refuge from the pressures of being a responsible adult. Maggie spent the rest of the weekend absorbing David's revelations, walking through the house where she had lived for over 50 years, seeing everything with new eyes. The picture emerging was of a man who had loved 2 women and 2 families, who had worked himself into an early grave trying to provide for everyone, who had planned to come clean about his double life, but died before he could follow through on his intentions. Monday morning, she called Michael Thompson and invited him to Cedar Falls for the following weekend. It was time to meet her husband's other son, time to begin understanding what kind of family they could become together. Michael arrived Saturday afternoon in a modest blue Honda Civic that reminded Maggie of the practical cars Bob had always preferred. Reliable transportation that served its purpose without calling attention to itself. She watched from her front window as he parked carefully at the curb and sat in his car for several minutes, gathering courage for a meeting that would change both their lives. When he finally emerged, she saw Bob's hesitant smile and determined posture, the same way Bob approached situations that required careful navigation. He was taller than she had expected from Linda's description, with Bob's broad shoulders and athletic build, but he moved with Linda's graceful economy of motion. His clothes were neat but inexpensive, khakis and a button-down shirt that looked like a teacher's wardrobe, practical and unpretentious. He carried a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, old-fashioned in a way that reminded her of Bob's attention to presentation. Maggie opened the door before he could knock, and they stood looking at each other for a moment that felt both endless and instantaneous. 2 people connected by a man they had both loved and lost, trying to figure out how to begin a relationship that had no precedent in either of their experiences. "Mrs. Harrison," he said softly, his voice carrying Bob's slight Iowa accent. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know this must be incredibly difficult. Please, call me Maggie, and come in. We have a lot to talk about." She led him to the living room, where family photos lined the mantelpiece in careful chronological order. Michael studied them quietly, taking in the progression of birthdays and graduations and holidays that had marked the Harrison family's public life. He pointed to a picture of Bob with David and Sarah at Sarah's high school graduation, both children in caps and gowns, Bob beaming with parental pride. "I remember that day," he said quietly. "Dad couldn't make it to my graduation because Sarah was graduating the same weekend. He sent me a card and a check, but I knew where he really needed to be. It was important for him to be there for his legal family during public moments." The casual acceptance in his voice surprised her. There was no bitterness, no resentment, just the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of someone who had grown up understanding the constraints of his situation. "You weren't angry?" "I was 18 and full of righteous indignation about the unfairness of it all. I wanted him to choose us, to make our family official and legitimate. But Mom helped me understand that Dad was doing the best he could in an impossible situation. He never promised me things he couldn't deliver, never made commitments he couldn't keep." Michael handed her the brown paper package, his gesture formal and respectful. "These are for you. Dad gave them to me over the years, but I think you should have them now that we're meeting properly." Inside were photographs of Bob that Maggie had never seen, pictures that revealed a side of her husband she had never witnessed. Bob at Michael's Little League games, wearing a baseball cap and cheering from the bleachers with the enthusiasm of any proud father. Bob at Michael's high school graduation, looking proud but staying carefully in the background to avoid questions about his relationship to the graduate. Bob teaching Michael to drive in an empty parking lot, both of them grinning at the camera with the joy of shared accomplishment. "He documented everything," Michael explained. "He said it was important to preserve memories, Even if they had to be private memories, he wanted proof that our relationship existed, even if it couldn't be public. Maggie studied each photograph carefully, seeing a side of Bob she had never witnessed. In their family pictures, Bob was always composed and responsible, the patriarch posing for posterity with appropriate dignity. In these pictures, he looked relaxed and joyful, like he was playing hooky from the weight of adult responsibility. "Tell me about him," she said, settling into her chair with the photos in her lap. "Tell me about the father you knew." For the next 3 hours, Michael shared stories that painted a complete picture of Bob as a weekend father who crammed a lifetime of parenting into stolen moments. He described fishing trips where Bob taught him to tie flies and read water, basketball games where Bob explained strategy and sportsmanship, late-night conversations where Bob shared wisdom about integrity and making difficult choices under pressure. He always said I had 2 families who loved me, even if one of them didn't know I existed yet. He was certain that someday you would all meet, that he would find a way to bring everyone together. He wanted me to be worthy of being your son and David and Sarah's brother when that day finally came. Weren't you angry that he never left his first family for yours? Michael considered the question carefully, the same way Bob used to think through complex problems before responding. When I was younger, yes. I wanted him to choose us, to make our family official, and give me his name legally. But as I got older, I realized that a man who would abandon his children for another woman wasn't the kind of father I wanted anyway. His loyalty to you and David and Sarah proved he was a man of his word, even when that loyalty created impossible situations. As the afternoon wore on, Maggie found herself warming to Michael's quiet wisdom and generous spirit. He asked thoughtful questions about David's law practice and Sarah's children, genuinely interested in learning about the family he had been excluded from. He shared stories about his own teaching career, his efforts to help students understand history as something alive and relevant, his belief that education could transform communities. When David and Sarah arrived for dinner, a meeting Maggie had arranged without telling them who would be joining them, the family resemblance was impossible to ignore. David and Michael had the same way of listening intently before responding, the same habit of running their hands through their hair when thinking through complex problems. Sarah and Michael shared the same expressive eyes and quick wit, the same tendency to use humor to diffuse tension. The initial awkwardness gave way to genuine curiosity as they discovered shared interests and perspectives. David and Michael discussed legal issues affecting public education funding. Sarah and Michael compared notes about raising teenagers in an era of social media and academic pressure. By the end of the evening, they were finishing each other's sentences and laughing at shared jokes that seemed to emerge from genetic memory. "This is surreal," Sarah said as they cleared dishes together. "I have a brother I've never known, but he feels familiar in ways I can't explain." "Dad used to tell me stories about both of you," Michael admitted. "I feel like I've been watching your lives from a distance for years, rooting for your successes and worrying about your problems without being able to participate." That night, after Michael had returned to his hotel room in downtown Cedar Falls, the 3 siblings sat in Maggie's living room, processing the evening's revelations. The house felt different somehow, more spacious, as if it had been holding its breath for decades and could finally exhale. "I understand why Dad loved him," David said thoughtfully. "He's everything Dad wanted us to be. Thoughtful, principled, unpretentious, dedicated to serving others. The weird thing is I'm not angry anymore," Sarah added. "I'm sad that we missed 48 years of knowing him, but I'm not angry about Dad having another family. It feels like we're more complete now, like we were missing a piece we didn't know was gone." Maggie looked at her children, all 3 of them now, and felt something she hadn't experienced since Bob's passing: wholeness. The family she thought she had lost when Bob died was actually larger than she had ever imagined, more complex and resilient than she had dared to hope. Sunday morning brought a conversation that would reshape their family forever. Michael joined them for breakfast at Maggie's kitchen table, and she found herself asking the question that had been building since their first meeting. What do you want from us, Michael? Long term, I mean. What would an ideal relationship look like to you? Michael set down his coffee cup and looked around the table at faces that shared his features and expressions. I want to be your brother, he said to David and Sarah. I want to be another uncle for my nieces and nephews to know and learn from. I want to be the part of family celebrations and family arguments and family traditions. I want to stop being a secret, stop living half a life. What about Linda? Maggie asked. How does she feel about all this coming out into the open? Mom is ready to step out of the shadows, too. She spent 48 years being the other woman, defining herself in relation to a relationship she could never fully claim. She'd like to be recognized as someone who loved your husband and raised his son with dignity. She doesn't want to replace you or compete with your memories, but she'd like to be acknowledged as part of Dad's story. The idea of welcoming Bob's longtime mistress into their family circle should have been impossible, but Maggie found herself considering it seriously. Linda had loved Bob, had raised his child, had accepted a half-life for decades without demanding more than he could give. In her own way, she had sacrificed as much as Maggie had, perhaps more. There's something else, Michael continued. Dad left something for all of us. Mr. Davidson, his lawyer, has been waiting for the right time to reveal it. He said Dad gave him specific instructions about when and how to share this information. David straightened in his chair. Dad's lawyer. I handled his estate personally. Everything was straightforward, completely transparent. Not everything. Dad left instructions that certain items were only to be revealed if and when both families came together. Mr. Davidson has been waiting 6 years for this conversation to happen. The following Tuesday, the expanded Harrison family gathered in Lawyer Davidson's oak-paneled office downtown. Maggie, David, Sarah, and Michael sat around the polished conference table while Davidson, now in his 70s and nearing retirement himself, pulled out a sealed envelope marked, "To be opened only in the presence of both families." Your father was the most meticulous planner I have ever worked with, Davidson explained, adjusting his reading glasses. He anticipated this day and wanted to leave you with his own words rather than letting you piece together his story from scattered evidence and incomplete information. The letter, written in Bob's careful handwriting on his professional letterhead, was addressed to my beloved families, both the one I claimed and the one I cherished in secret. It began with an apology that was both comprehensive and specific, acknowledging the pain his choices had caused while explaining the love and sense of duty that had motivated his actions. I know that my death has left you all with questions I should have answered while I was alive, the letter read. I know that discovering each other without my guidance has been painful and confusing, full of revelations that have challenged everything you believed about our family. I take full responsibility for creating a situation where the people I loved most were kept from knowing each other. Bob's letter went on to explain his philosophy of love and duty, his belief that love was not finite but could expand to encompass multiple relationships without diminishing any of them. He wrote about his early attraction to Linda, his decision to maintain both relationships rather than choosing between them, his hope that someday both families could exist together openly and honestly. Margaret, you gave me stability, respectability, and children I was proud to claim publicly. You were my anchor in every storm, my partner in building something lasting and meaningful. You made me a better man by expecting the best from me. Linda, you gave me passion, adventure, and a different kind of family that challenged me to be spontaneous and present in the moment. You were my refuge from the weight of responsibility, my reminder that life could be joyful and surprising. The letter included specific instructions for a trust fund he had established years earlier. money that had been accumulating interest for 6 years, designated for the education of all his grandchildren, both those he had acknowledged publicly, and any future children his sons and daughters might have. He had also purchased a family cemetery plot, large enough for both wives, acknowledging that they might someday choose to be buried near him if they could find peace with their shared history. Most surprising was his final request, that the families consider spending one holiday together each year, allowing his grandchildren to know all their relatives, and giving his wives the opportunity to understand the women who had shared his heart and shaped his character. I die hoping that you will find a way to forgive my deceptions and embrace the love that connected us all, the letter concluded. You are all better people than I was, more generous and more courageous, and I trust you to create the family unity I was too cowardly to pursue while I was alive. The room was silent as Davidson finished reading, the weight of Bob's words settling over them like a blessing and a challenge. Finally, Maggie spoke, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. When is Linda planning to visit Cedar Falls? I could ask her to come next weekend, Michael offered. If you're ready for that step? Maggie looked around the table at her children, the ones she had raised and the ones she was still getting to know. I think it's time we all met properly. The following Saturday, Linda Thompson arrived in Cedar Falls carrying a covered dish and a bouquet of flowers from her garden. She was nervous but determined, wearing a simple blue dress that Maggie recognized from one of Bob's favorite photographs, the one he kept on his office desk where clients could see it if they looked carefully. The two women stood in Maggie's foyer, studying each other with the intensity of former rivals who had been forced to become allies. Linda was smaller than Maggie had expected, more fragile, with eyes that held decades of carefully maintained hope, mixed with realistic acceptance of limitations. I brought green bean casserole, Linda said, offering the dish with hands that trembled slightly. Bob mentioned it was his favorite, but I wasn't sure if you made it the same way I do. I never made green bean casserole, Maggie admitted, accepting the dish and inhaling the familiar aroma. Bob always said he didn't like casseroles, preferred simple meat and potatoes. Linda's face crumpled slightly. He ate my green bean casserole every Sunday at our house for 23 years. Said it reminded him of church potlucks when he was growing up. The revelation was both painful and oddly comforting. Bob had maintained different preferences, different traditions, different versions of himself for each family. The man who claimed to dislike elaborate cooking with Maggie had eaten comfort food every week with Linda, participating in domestic rituals that connected him to childhood memories he had never shared with his legal wife. Over the course of the day, as both families gathered in Maggie's living room and dining room, the two women shared stories that painted a complete picture of the man they had both loved. Maggie learned that Bob had been more adventurous with Linda, trying ethnic restaurants and taking spontaneous weekend trips to small towns across Iowa. Linda learned that Bob had been more ambitious with Maggie, planning for retirement and discussing long-term financial goals with the seriousness of someone building a legacy. He was a different man with each of us, Linda observed as they prepared dinner together. Not false, just different sides of the same person. Like a prism, Maggie agreed, watching Linda move around her kitchen with the confidence of someone who had spent decades cooking for a family. The same light, refracted into different colors depending on the angle. By evening, they had reached an understanding that surprised them both. They would never be close friends. Too much history stood between them for that kind of intimacy. But they could be united in their love for Bob's children and grandchildren, partners in preserving his memory, while building something new from the pieces of their separate lives. The year that followed brought gradual integration and unexpected discoveries. Michael became a regular presence at family gatherings, bringing his warmth and Bob's sense of humor to celebrations that had felt incomplete since Bob's death. Linda attended Sarah's daughter's graduation from high school, and David's promotion to senior partner at his law firm. The families learned to navigate shared space and divided loyalties, creating new traditions that honored their complicated history. Maggie found unexpected freedom in the expanded family structure. Instead of being the sole keeper of Bob's memory, she could share that responsibility with Linda, comparing notes and filling in gaps in each other's knowledge. Instead of being the only grandparent figure for her children's children, she could step back occasionally and let Linda provide different wisdom and perspectives. Most surprisingly, she discovered aspects of herself that had been dormant during her traditional marriage. With Bob's secret life revealed and accepted, she felt permission to explore her own interests more fully. She began writing a comprehensive family history that included all of Bob's children, started taking watercolor classes at the community college, and even considered joining an online dating service for seniors. The real transformation came during their first shared Thanksgiving, 18 months after Maggie's initial discovery in the attic. As she looked around her dining room table at David and his wife, Sarah and her family, Michael and Linda, and even Linda's elderly mother who had driven up from Missouri, she realized that Bob's greatest legacy wasn't his deception, but his capacity for love that had expanded their definitions of family. "I want to say something before we eat," she announced as they prepared for the blessing. "Bob made choices that hurt all of us, kept secrets that caused pain and confusion. But he also loved all of us in ways that expanded our family beyond traditional boundaries. I'm grateful for his mistakes because they led us to each other." Linda reached across the table and squeezed Maggie's hand. "He would be proud of the family we've become together." Michael raised his wine glass, his expression serious but joyful. "To Dad, who taught us that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real, and that families can be built from forgiveness as well as blood." As they toasted Bob's memory, Maggie felt the weight of secrets finally lifting from her shoulders. At 79, she had discovered that her life's greatest tragedy had also been its greatest gift, the revelation that love, even complicated and imperfect love, could create connections stronger than traditional family bonds. The house in Cedar Falls was finally ready for sale, but Maggie had decided to keep it after all. It would serve as the gathering place for their unconventional family, the neutral ground where Bob's children could continue building relationships he had started but never completed. The attic had been cleaned and organized, transformed from a repository of secrets into a proper storage space for shared family history. In the wooden box that had started everything, the letters remained as historical documents, evidence of a love story that had been complicated but genuine. The photographs had been copied and distributed, allowing everyone to see the Bob they had known and the Bob they were still discovering. What had once been evidence of betrayal had become the foundation for unexpected grace and expanded understanding. Standing in her living room on a crisp autumn evening, exactly 2 years after her discovery, Maggie Harrison looked at the family photos that now included Michael's graduation pictures and Linda's birthday celebrations. She thought about the woman she had been, dutiful, trusting, content to live within the boundaries others had set for her. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more curious, more willing to embrace complexity and uncertainty. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Emma, Sarah's daughter, calling to announce her acceptance to Iowa State University, where she planned to study education and follow in her Uncle Michael's footsteps. "Grandpa would be proud," Emma said. "Even if he was a really complicated grandpa. Especially because he was complicated," Maggie replied. "Simple people rarely leave such